Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I'm your host, Steve. We are on Facebook and Twitter, and you can find both by searching for A to Z History. This might look like episode 100 to you, but it is not. If you include our sidetrack episodes, we are rapidly approaching 200 episodes. A special announcement today is we are back on Patreon. Click on the link in the show notes or search in Patreon for the History of the Papacy podcast to learn more about the new and improved Patreon experience. The tiers are similar as before, but with even more benefits. Plus, you are helping to support the show, which is huge. There's a lot that goes on to keep this show going, not only monetary, but a huge time commitment, and it really helps every little bit you can do to support the show. And in that vein, before we get too far, I'd like to thank Terry for his kind and generous donation on PayPal. The Agora Podcaster of the Month is the newest member of the network, Sam Hume, of two podcasts, The History of Witchcraft and Pax Britannica. You can find links to both in the show notes. Now on to today's podcast episode. In the last episode, we wrapped up a major phase in the papacy, the Byzantine domination of the papacy. That era was incredibly important for the evolution of the Roman papacy as an institution. What is particularly interesting about this phase of the papacy is that it has a definitive ending. So many time periods in history don't have a firm end date. Scholars, historians, archaeologists, and linguists will debate all day that a certain date is accurate or not for the ending of a historical epoch. In this case, though, after Pope Zacharias in 752, the papacy was in a very different position than it was before, with a clear breaking point. I thought it would be a good time to do a little review and a little preview of things to come. In the next two episodes, we will look at the top 7 heresies of Christianity. Some of the heresies we will discuss happened before the late 700s, early 800s, and some had their beginnings in this time period and grew through the ages. Now, if you like what you hear, you can also watch this episode on my YouTube channel. Of course, I'm still working with Nick Barksdale of the Study of Antiquity in the Middle Ages podcast, YouTube channel. But I also have my own channel where you can watch many of the newest episodes of the podcast. You can find the channel by searching in YouTube for the History of the Papacy podcast or by clicking on the link in the show notes. When you are there, like and subscribe to my channel and hit the bell to receive updates. Video is definitely still a work in progress for me, but I have a lot of exciting things planned for the YouTube channel in the future, especially YouTube exclusive content. Well, with all of that, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, you can always send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Now let's talk heresy. Heresy is always a matter of perspective. One man's heresy is another man's orthodoxy, you might say. This works for religion equally with politics, academia, art, sports, or any other discipline which requires taking a side. Heresy is controversial and emotional in every way. The mainstream has to define the borders of their mainstream beliefs. Similarly, the outsider belief has to define its own intellectual borders in relation to the mainstream. That is how the difference between views becomes competing camps instead of marginal ideas inside of the mainstream. Orthodoxy and heterodoxy are always on a spectrum where a clear dividing line between the two is drawn, usually for specific group reasons. We'll explore a few of the heretical groups that have developed and were defined against Orthodox Christianity. By Orthodox, we'll take the baseline of pretty much mainstream sacramental Christianity, sort of what evolved from the Bar Ehrman and what others call Proto-Orthodoxy. I'm going to keep the baseline as rather general because in any debate over canonical versus uncanonical, the details matter, and I don't want to get completely bogged down in the details. We'd be here for the next millennium or two at least. Today's episode complements well with another two-part series of episodes I recorded previously called A Monument of Heresy, which was Sidetrack episodes 43 and 44 respectively. You don't have to listen to them first or anything to get the most out of this episode, but I think they're there for your enjoyment, and they are a good complement to these two episodes, which I've split up into two conveniently chunks of information. So I guess the big question is, and the question we need to start off with is, what is heresy? Heresy is the opposite of orthodoxy. Heresy comes from the word heterodox. Heterodoxy and orthodoxy both come from Greek roots. Orthros meaning right or true, and doxa meaning opinion, so right or true opinion. Heterodox comes from heteros meaning other, and doxa again meaning opinion. So heterodox, the root of heresy, means an other opinion. Two ways of thinking on this is opinions are either right or wrong. And when you boil it down, this is how most issues play out. There's a spectrum, but ultimately a line is drawn whether people agree or are on the same team, basically. And if we think about it that way, we're really focusing in on this dividing line, because eventually there really does have to be a dividing line between a right opinion and another opinion. So why a top 7? Well, that's really a play on Christian numerology. 7's a very important number in early Christian writings. The Book of Revelation and others use this 7 golden number plenty of times. The 7 cardinal virtues, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 cities of Ephesus from the Book of Revelation. So there's so many groups that were defined by themselves or by the mainstream as orthodox or heretical. And so I had to limit this list somewhere, and this is definitely not a comprehensive list. It's definitely a broad view of heretical movements, especially in what I would say is the first millennium of Christianity. There'll be some outliers to that, but I'm kind of casting a wide net here. So what was heresy in the Christian context? It's a disagreement really over 3 main points. Number 1 is Christology, and that's who is Christ, the main figure in the religion. Number 2 is Gnosticism, and that's the relationship between the material and the spiritual world, and that's a huge issue. And then 3 is church practice and organization. What do you do? How do you do it? And how do you do the various parts of the church work together to serve the people and, essentially do the religion? Number 7 on the list that we're going to start off with is early Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a very, very old proposition in Christianity. Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, or knowledge. Gnostics claim to hold a special or secret knowledge. A believer had to have a connection to that secret world. Gnosticism is an umbrella term for a huge diversity of movements. And here's some of their overarching beliefs. There was a spiritual and a physical world, and that's pretty much common in all of Christianity. But in Gnosticism, the spiritual realm was much more important than the physical or the material. Basically, the spiritual is good, physical, at least not good, and possibly evil. So making Gnosticism a highly dualistic religion. The creator of the world is a lesser god, or the demiurge, and not the true transcendental Godhead. Gnostics had many of their own gospels and sacred books, and they were connected and influenced heavily by Greek philosophy, Greek mystery cults, and Persian religious cults. The Gospels mention a certain Simon Magus, or Simon the Magician. He's said to be the founder of Gnosticism and the father of all heresies. He's mentioned in the book of Acts and some other sources, and he had it out with Saints Peter and Paul in these early sources. There was a really cool scene of like a magical religious duel between the two in the Roman Forum, which is almost certainly didn't happen, regardless of any other issues of historicity of Peter and Paul, etc., etc. But it's just such a great story. And I discussed that in a previous episode on Simon Magus, or Simon the Magician. Anyway, any number of Gnostic thinkers form their own movements, and examples are the Valentinians, Marcionisms, the Sethites. There's basically anybody who had an opinion could just go and form their own sects. Much of what we know about the Gnostics came from two sources: the Orthodox writers who were against Gnosticism, such as Irenaeus of Lyon, who wrote a book called Against Heresies, and then the Gnostic Gospels. And a large trove of codices were found in a place called Nag Hammadi in Egypt in the 1940s, and many of these were these Gnostic Gospels. Most of these gospels that were found in this trove were actually mentioned in the much earlier polemical works. I'm talking like 300s, 400s, but were lost along the way. These Gnostic Gospels, they followed the traditional gospel accounts to some degree, but then went way off in other things. So they followed the narrative, but then spiced them up with their own interesting parts that basically held up their Gnostic views. Gnosticism was actually very strong in the burgeoning Christian communities across the Mediterranean world. Clearly, based on the amount of written about them, the Proto-Orthodox were definitely worried about these Gnostic movements, and Gnosticism in many ways was an add-on module to Proto-Orthodox Christianity. The Proto-Orthodox and the Gnostics essentially did the same things in practice, but understood the theology of what they did in very different ways. And over time, that's when these groups really spread out. Over the decades and centuries, Gnosticism faded out in the West, except for one group called the Manichaeans, and they were founded by a fellow named Mani. It included Christian, Jewish, Persian, Zoroastrian religious elements. Manichaeism was highly Gnostic and dualistic. It lasted for many centuries in the Middle East and in Central Asia, and even into Far Eastern Asia. And it most likely influenced later Christian Gnostic and dualistic movements that came back around to the West in the Middle Ages, and that's a really interesting story. Now, let's go on to number 6 on the list, iconoclasm. Icons are sacred liturgical art used for worship, such as statues, paintings, mosaics, etc. In the Christian context, icons and religious art go all the way back to pre-Christian Second Temple Judaism. Ancient synagogues were actually filled with sacred art, and the earliest known church in Dura Europos was completely decorated with iconography and that was used for liturgical worship. There is obviously a sticking point, and it's that whole second commandment thing from the Old Testament. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 4 and 5, we hear this: "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." That's pretty clear, right? As with most interpretations in Christianity and religion in general, the answer is in fact no. It should be noted the Roman Catholic Church uses a modified version of the Ten Commandments that's a bit different and includes some slightly different wording. Various traditions and interpretations came about on this Old Testament commandment. In Christianity, Jesus is the likeness of God, icon from the Greek eikonai, meaning likeness, form, mirror image, etc. So creating images of Jesus is okay, but not of God the Father. And this is a huge theological discussion and debate. So stick with me here. And I should just mention that this is just a little taste of iconoclasm. In other episodes, I'm going to do a real deep dive into this whole controversy because it's fascinating and there's a lot of political elements, but this is really the 10,000 foot view. But so basically creating a picture of Jesus or a saint is okay to venerate because it is veneration and not worship. It's kind of like having a picture of your grandmother up on the wall. You're not worshiping her or acting that image on photo paper is actually your grandmother. It's a representation or a form of your grandmother. Modern Judaism evolved in a very different direction. All forms of depictive religious art were deemed idolatry. Islam took this idea even further, and that's why iconoclasm and icons will become a major issue in the 700s. And it's really the first 700 years or so of Christianity. There's a serious debate over Christology. Basically, who was Jesus? Was he a divine being, a semi-divine being, a great human, a vessel for the divine, some combination of human, divine, and everything in between? By the 700s, that had been mostly figured out and settled by the Orthodox mainstream. There were a few disagreements and schisms within the mainstream, but there was a broad spectrum that was confirmed. The three main branches of Christianity by this point had figured out that basically that Jesus was both God and man in some formulation. And these three main branches of Christianity as of the 700s, they were very similar in practice, but they had this disagreement of the exact formulation of how Jesus was both human and divine. Now, iconoclasm means the breaking of icons in Greek. Certain secular leaders were warming up to the idea that veneration of icons was spilling over into the area of worship of icons. And remember, the Arabs at this time were really beating the Byzantines at every single turn. The Arabs and Islam were full-blown against the icons. And the Emperor of Byzantium, or the Eastern Roman Empire, his logic was, well, maybe these icons are the problem, and they really are idolatry. The emperors, this is the basic, them and their theologians' logic. You can really only depict Jesus's human nature in an icon, and that's heretical because you're saying that Jesus was only human. You cannot depict his divine nature, because if you depicted his divine nature, that would be idolatry. Depicting and venerating saints and Virgin Mary was really tantamount to idolatry, and really, where was the dividing line between veneration and worship? They basically believed that veneration of icons had just gone way, way too far. The emperor started to really put the squeeze on icons and the people who liked icons. They destroyed them, they defaced them, they painted over them. This attack on icons was highly unpopular with large portions of the population and amongst important monks who were really the influencers of that day. It was also highly unpopular in the former Western Empire, which religiously was Latin and highly influenced by the popes in Rome. In Rome, they really felt that this was just another heresy in the East, and really, here we go again. And at this point, they were more of like, let's just ignore this and let it burn out. There's a big change in imperial dynasty, and things swung back again in favor of the icons. There was a council called the Seventh Ecumenical Council in 787. This made icons the official policy of the church, including both the Byzantines and the Romans. The other churches that I had mentioned earlier that kind of they were in schism with Rome and Byzantium at this point, mainly the Miaphysites of Egypt and the Middle East, and then the Nestorians of the Far East, Persia, and the Middle East to some degree. They didn't really have a say in all of this, and they had their own ideas on icons that would evolve throughout the years, that we'll probably get into a little bit into the main episode that we do on iconoclasm. Now, iconoclasm, it would pop up again in the Eastern Roman Empire in the 700s and the 800s, but it would never really get traction again. But iconoclasm would kind of come back around again and become popular in certain quarters of the Protestant Reformation. This whole idea of 4 blank walls and a sermon theology. Some Protestants to this day are extremely aniconic. And there was examples in the early modern period of times where church art was destroyed and adornment in churches was destroyed. The Roman Catholic Church, and especially the Eastern churches, Eastern Orthodox, like I said, the Oriental Orthodox, are still in favor of icons and iconography to this day. Now we have number 5 on the list, Nestorianism. This is our very first heresy on the list that involves Christology directly. And remember, I included Nestorianism in this idea of mainstream Christology, where that dividing line and these border lines were drawn. Even though there's not a huge difference in Christology between Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy in one hand, and Oriental Orthodoxy in another. But anyways, Christology is the study or discussion of who Jesus is and how he fits into the religion. Now we have the Trinity, God the Father, Jesus, Holy Spirit. They're all equal but separate aspects of the Godhead. It's much more complicated than meets the eye, though. Now let's talk about Nestorius first. He was on our monument of heresy, but now we're going to focus in more on his movement and how they were defined as heresy. Nestorius is the person who gives Nestorianism its name, and Nestorianism is really a bad name or a description for this theology. Nestorius wasn't the founder of the movement. not even close to its biggest or most prominent thinker, and really not even a complete supporter of the movement. What Nestorius was a patriarch or head bishop of Constantinople in the 400s. He was from Syria, Antioch to be particular, and was therefore a follower of the Antiochene school of theology. And this was a theology that Jesus had two natures. But what is nature in this context? The simple answer is, what was Jesus made of? We are humans. We're made of human stuff. God the Father is God. He's made of God stuff. Jesus is the Son of God and a human mother. So what's he made of? And this debate raged over hundreds of years before and hundreds of years after Nestorius. Nestorius and the Antiochene school believed that Jesus had two natures, human and divine, combined in one person. An example is that I've used in the past too is a bottle of Italian dressing. Oil and vinegar are mixed together in one bottle, but they can separate and be distinguishable from each other, or they can be mixed up together. The idea that Jesus had two natures was the most common in Christian thought. That was really the mainstream. It was really the different ideas on how these two natures work together. Was it two natures combined together to make a new nature? One primary divine nature with some sort of human nature? Two full natures, both human and divine. This is what would become the Christology of the Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox churches. Now, there's a Nestorian problem, the two separate natures, and this is what makes the dividing line between, say, the two-nature Christology of the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholics and the Oriental Miaphysite Christians. Here's some of the controversies that surround Nestorianism. Now, Nestorians said that Mary couldn't be the Theotokos, or God-bearer, mother of God. She was the mother of the Christ's human nature, the Christotokos. This really got under the skin of many in the mainstream Orthodox camp. Mary was the mother of the united one nature or new nature of Jesus, not the mother of his half nature. The Antiochene school was highly influential in parts of the Middle East, and it also had influence on theologians in the West and Rome. Although the Roman Church was not Nestorian, but some of those ideas did percolate into Rome. It's a fine difference, but it definitely is a difference. Nestorianism was condemned across the Roman world in 3 ecumenical councils and many regional councils. This forced Nestorianism to look outside of the Roman Empire to spread, and spread they did. All across the Persian Empire, into India, and even all the way to China and Japan, all before the year 800. So before the time that Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans in 800, which is really the time where where we're starting getting into the Middle Ages proper and out of the Dark Ages. Nestorianism is all the way into China. Ironically, Nestorianism had a ton of influences on religion in the Middle East, or in the Middle East, but definitely in Central and Eastern Asia. One of those is that Nestorianism helped Buddhism spread into China. Nestorianism spread under the Persians and Islam, but then was faced with severe persecutions under Islam later. If also many years later into the late medieval period and the early modern period, the Nestorian Church faced severe genocide from the Ottomans, Turks, which led to the Assyrian genocide, a very much similar situation to the Armenian genocide. And that's a fascinating story as well. The quote-unquote Nestorians still exist today in parts of Iraq and in diaspora around the world. They even have a common Christological agreement today with the Roman Catholic Church, and they're building closer relationships with the Eastern Orthodox Church today. I mean, you see that many centuries and even millennia, and the world changes quite a bit, and these Christological debates aren't quite as important now as they were then, or you can kind of paper over those differences. And that's one of the interesting things with these debates over Christology. I really do plan on doing a series of episodes on this whole spread of the Nestorian Church to China. That's coming up soon. It's on my list, and I can't wait to dive into it. Now we're on to number 4 on the list, the later Gnosticism. We talked about earlier Gnostic movement a couple of heresies ago. Gnosticism came back in force in the Middle Ages with a few significant movements. Some are more well-known than others, and some not as much. Some of the names that we'll throw around today are the Bogomiles, the Cathars, the Paulicians, and the Albigenses. These neo-Gnostic movements have many similarities between themselves and the Gnostics of the first few centuries of Christianity. Both medieval and modern scholars notice these similarities, and they assume that there must have been some connection, even though they were really separated by centuries. There was a very convenient connection that could be made between ancient and medieval Gnosticism, and this is either a smoking gun, a silver bullet, a perfect explanation, or just way too convenient. Now, oftentimes I find, at least, that sometimes when people connect the threads that seem obvious, there's some underlying things that make it that it's not as obvious as you think it might be. Let's go with the easy origin story, or more of the silver bullet explanation, the direct connection between early Gnosticism and later Gnosticism. As we said in the early Gnosticism section, certain Gnostic groups broke off from Christian Gnosticism in the late Antiquity, and that was the Manichaeism group. Manichaeism held many beliefs of Christianity, but also Zoroastrianism, Greco-Roman paganism, and other belief systems. They kind of just soaked all of those up in the different places that they went. Manichaeism was extremely dualistic. There was spirituality was the only good, and materiality was evil and from the devil. Manichaeism spread strongly into the East through Persia and Central Asia. Manichaeism influenced groups in Asia Minor and Armenia. They really did. They took influences from places that they were, and they also influenced certain groups that were in the places they were. One such group was the Paulicians, and the Paulicians were quite Gnostic to begin with, and they were severely persecuted by the Byzantines, and some moved to Thrace in the 900s or so, kind of a wildish borderland where they could have a little bit of independence. Once there, the Paulicians influenced a group called the Bogomiles of Bulgaria. The Bogomiles were also extremely dualistic, and this group pretty quickly fell afoul of the Bulgarian and Byzantine Orthodox churches in their areas. The Bogomiles rejected both ecclesiastical and civil authority, and that's not a great recipe in the Middle Ages, and especially not in the Eastern Byzantine Roman Empire. You're not going far with that kind of philosophy and the theology, civil philosophy and theology. The Bogomiles spread their message all over the Balkans, and they became a major official religion for a time in both Hungary and Bosnia. The Bogomiles were eventually excommunicated by both the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. a little later on, the Bosnian Bogomils converted in large numbers to Islam. Really, a lot of times these groups, when you start to strip down certain aspects of Christology, these ideas start to really line up quite closely with the Muslim Christology, which, yes, Islam really does have a Christology. It's very, very different from mainstream Christian theology, but the Muslims do have an idea on who Christ was. And a lot of times like I said, when you some of these groups, when you start drifting over, you get into more of a Muslim idea of who Christ was, and you're a lot more comfortable with fitting into a Muslim religious context than they were with the Christian context. And when, obviously, if you move in that direction, it's pretty easy to become that other religion and just cast off any of the other, some of those things that just become extraneous at that point. Now, the Bogomils, incidentally, also spread into France in the beginning of the year 1000, which is really interesting and kind of unexpected. And this is where we get into that more controversial part. Those that move of the Manichaeans to the Papacyans to the Bogomils, that's pretty solid. It's this part of the Bogomils going into southern France and parts of Italy and other parts of Western Europe that's a little more tenuous. So if this part is true, then the Bogomils influenced a group called the Cathars, or as they're also known as the Albigensians or the Albigenses. So that's quite a transmission chain. The Manichaeans, the original Gnostics from Western Europe that split off from Christianity and kind of formed their own things, they move east, influenced movements that wind up working their way back where the Manichaeans had begun hundreds of years before. That's a huge circle there. That's fascinating. And like I said, that's one of the greatest stories in history, if it's in fact true. Now, there is a simpler explanation. The Cathars could have grown out of a movement of monasticism and reform and asceticism that was sweeping through Roman Catholicism at that time and the West. This is the ideas that brought us the Franciscans and other groups that would become canonical and some that did not. Maybe Catharism didn't have any contact with Eastern Gnosticism or Manichaeanism at all. It was just a coevolution from trends that were already going on in the West. And you see that, that evolution of that idea of coevolution, and connection is something that really needs to be studied very carefully by the scholars. When scholars and academics look at that, they really look closely. Is something a coevolution, or is there an influence? The Cathars or the Albigensians were another extremely dualistic and Gnostic group of southern France. Let's just quickly talk about the Cathar beliefs. They believed in all the usual things that we've stated before. Specifically, they had two classes of adherents, the perfecti and the believers. The perfecti took sacraments to live a perfect life. They didn't, there's certain things they didn't do. They didn't marry. They didn't eat meat, eggs, or any animal products. So basically, how Eastern monks lived throughout the centuries, really from the time when monasticism started in the East in the 200s and the 300s, this idea of not eating meat products, not eating eggs or anything like that, eating completely vegan and an extreme asceticism. The Cathars didn't take Catholic sacraments. They were itinerant preachers, and they took an extreme vow and a complete vow of poverty. Now, this lifestyle isn't for everyone, obviously. I mean, looking at monasticism, even amongst clergy monasticism is a small group or a subset of them. So that, you know, these, perfecti are taking it in its complete totality, but not everybody can do that. So then there's the believers, and the believers tried to do all of these things, but it wasn't an expectation. They could even take Catholic sacraments in some circumstances. Believers could become perfecti if they took on those extreme vows of ascetical vows. Anyhow, the Cathars they majorly ran into trouble with both the ecclesiastical and civil authorities. And it's a hugely complicated topic, and it involved the secular politics of France, Spain, the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Empire, and more. Eventually, a major crusade was launched against the Cathars, and this is where we get the beginnings of the Inquisition. After a long, long fight, the Cathars were pretty much completely destroyed, and they were severely persecuted. Large-scale fighting back and forth across southern France and northern Spain during this crusade really changed the whole identity of the area, and this is another area of history of the Middle Ages that was a major focus for change. In the end, the Cathars, the Bogomiles, the Paulicians, and other Gnostic groups were either destroyed, folded back into the mainstream of Catholicism or Eastern, Christianity, or converted to other faiths. And any revivals today, there are revivals of Catharism and other Gnostic sects. They're really not directly connected to the historical movements. There's no line of transmission of a church that stayed together from the Manichaeans to the Paulicians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's really a rebirth of those movements. All right, that is all we have for today. Look for the top 3 heresies in the next episode. You don't want to miss it. This was really a quick overview of a number of really interesting groups in the Christian religion. And it's only the tip of the iceberg. If you'd like to learn more of these topics, I highly suggest you subscribe to the History of the Papacy podcast on iTunes or your favorite podcatcher, Stitcher, etc. If you're already subscribed to the History of the Papacy podcast, you can also subscribe to our YouTube partner, Nick Barksdale's study of Antiquity in the Middle Ages, who turns many of our podcast episodes into full-length video documentaries, and you can also see me on there too. You can subscribe and make sure you hit the like button so that you get all the updates of Nick's great channel, and he also has many other podcasters and academics who he turns their great lectures and podcasts into full video production. So I would definitely highly suggest you go there, but look for the next time for our top 3 heresies, and I will see you on our next stop on our trip through the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.